From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrove, and my co-host David Feldman is observing Yom Kippur as we record this. He's atoning, which is ironic because I think one of the things I expect him to atone for is not being here today. So it's just kind of a vicious circle for him. But we also have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody.
We have another special program today. In a lot of ways, our guest today, Phil Donahue, is the father of us all here in broadcasting, not to mention podcasting. That's because the original Phil Donahue Show was born in Dayton, Ohio, not exactly a travel hub for the country's movers and shakers. So his show was one of the first, if not the first, if I'm not mistaken, to use conference call technology to engage with guests on the phone who couldn't make the trip to Dayton. On our show here, we do much the same thing, except we are all in remote locations. I'm in Los Angeles, David is generally in New York, Ralph is in DC, and our guests have come to us from all over the country and the world. So Phil Donahue literally invented the modern daytime talk show. His most frequent guest was our very own Ralph Nader, who appeared on the show nearly 30 times over the years. This will be Mr. Donahue's second appearance on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, so we have some catching up to do on that score. Mr. Donahue's last visit, we talked about the award-winning documentary he produced entitled Body of War, about the life of Iraq war veteran, the late Thomas Young. Today, we will discuss his views on a broad range of issues involving the media and politics. It's a rare treat for all of us. I also pulled up a YouTube video of Phil interviewing a young Donald Trump in 1987. I believe it was around the time Trump's book, The Art of the Deal, came out. Maybe we can get some recollections of the dealings he's had with our current president over those years in New York. In addition, we will, as always, take some time to check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber, to get the latest on what's happening in the shadows of the corporate state. And if we have time, we'll talk about some other things. But first, let's talk to the father of us all, the Phil Donahue Show. Had nearly a 30-year run on American television that along the way garnered him 20 Emmy Awards. The show touched on the serious social and political issues of the day and was the first to include audience participation. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Phil Donahue.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I want several copies of your introduction. Thank you. Welcome back indeed, Phil. When Studs Terkel interviewed you, right after your book, Donahue, My Own Story, came out in 1979, published by Simon & Schuster, which I hope would actually reissue it. It's so engrossing and relevant to today's times, if only by comparison, the media then and the media now. But Studs Terkel, who's done a few interviews himself, he was out of Chicago and he interviewed all kinds of people and put them into books. He was interviewing you on February 1, 1980, and he said, quote, "I think the two interviewers I most respect working today are Oriana Fallaci and Phil Donahue. That sounds like a strange combination. Oriana Fallaci had a remarkable way of drawing out people in power, in fact, revealing them as they are. And Phil Donahue has a way of drawing out people primarily powerless," end quote. Well, you've done over 6,000 one-hour television shows in your storied career, and you have had your share of different entertainment models on the show, but you also broke ground again and again, giving first voice to powerless people. As far as I can remember, whether it's the workers, the consumers, the environment, women's rights, gay, lesbian rights, and many other people who are the dissenters. And you taught us that the mother of assent is dissent in American history and has to be protected. You broke all this ground, and in the process, you had imitators, of course, but I don't think people today who are under 35 or 40 appreciate the groundbreaking nature. When someone who couldn't get an interview on a tiny radio station in Texarkana got on your show, they reached over 10 million people. Today, a cable show with 3 million is considered pretty good. So how do you, when you look back on this, Phil, You must make some comparison with today's mass media and when you were coming up the ranks in the 60s and 70s. Can you share some of your observations and also comment on what afternoon daytime television is about also?
Well, thank you, Ralph, and thank you for all the times you were on my show. I recall working very hard to get you to be on my program, and of course I would call your office and your secretary would say, "Phil, who?" I was only a local show at the time.
In Dayton?
In Dayton, Ohio, which was not the crossroads of the world, but I'm lucky that my program was born in Dayton. It's a town built on brains. NCR gave the world the cash register. The bell heard round the world. Charles Kettering, the suburb of Kettering, Ohio, was named, invented the starter motor. Remember the crank? I'm not sure I do. I'm not old enough to remember that. But, and then, of course, there were these guys who owned a bicycle shop, and I forget what they gave the world. I thought about them as I walked up the spiral staircase of a double-decker aircraft. When we began our show in 1968, we really weren't sure that we would survive. And that's not mock humility. That was the fact. Everything we competed with was either a spinning wheel or Monty Hall saying, "Come on down," giving a contestant $5,000 who was dressed like a chicken salad sandwich. The daytime schedule was either soap operas or game shows with spinning wheels and much excitement, and neon signs would say, "Applause, applause," and the audience would dutifully applaud. So here I come with one guest for an hour. We were a visually dull show. And I remember I just thought Ralph was on a pedestal. I was so enamored with Ralph. I thought he was right on all the issues, and I don't want to embarrass him with my praise, but I just couldn't get him. And I heard that he was coming to Dayton through Cincinnati, an airport in Kentucky, as you might know. So I actually went down unannounced to meet his aircraft, because I just felt that if I said, "Hi, Ralph, I'm Phil Donahue," I knew he would say, "You came all the way from Dayton to meet me at the airport? How can I turn you down?" So there he was, comes down the stairs in his skinny tie and his shoes, which he bought at an Army-Navy store in his junior year in high school. And I'm standing there as he came out, and I said, "Hi, Ralph, I'm Phil Donahue." And he said, "You came all the way from Dayton to meet me here? How can I turn you down?"
I wasn't the only one. You would go to the airport to meet a lot of your guests. It was unheard of at the time.
Well, yes, I did. I mean, I drove. Now you're going to get me yakking, Ralph, and it's going to get boring. I drove John Rock to and from the airport. John Rock was the physician who invented the birth control pill. He invented the pill that arrested somehow ovulation, so that if a woman took the pill every day or whatever it was, she avoided pregnancy. Well, that was a bombshell of a liberation for women all over the world. And I was just awed by this man. I picked up Norman Rockwell and his wife at the airport.
The Norman Rockwell?
Yeah. I mean, I was such a lucky duck. I mean, I was meeting all these people. And the older I get, the more impressed I am with the opportunities I had as the host of a show. But our show was special in that you were on for an hour. You weren't rushed. We certainly had our share of commercials. But you had some time to make your point. And we're still scared about competing with a woman dressed like a chicken salad sandwich. So I pick up Ralph in a 1957 Chevy, no seatbelts. And this was prior to Ralph successfully getting Detroit to literally put imagine this achievement. You can't sell a car today without seatbelts. You can't manufacture a car today without seatbelts. And Ralph was, he looked thinner, just working to get the big three to install seatbelts in the car. So here we are on the air with Ralph and an audience of mostly housewives from the Miami Valley area, southwestern Ohio. And Ralph starts, and he talks about the projections from the dashboard, and that what happens is you die in the second accident. You're an egg in a crate, and when you have a collision, you rattle around the inside of the automobile, and if you don't have a collapsing steering wheel, your sternum is punctured by the force that throws you forward, and if you don't have specially designed locks that stay closed, you are ejected from the car. And if you're ejected from the car, your chances of survival are significantly reduced. If your head strikes your dashboard, you may not die, but you will drool for the rest of your life. Well, the housewives in the audience were slack-jawed. They couldn't take their eyes off this guy from Washington, D.C., who they had read about. And the ratings went through the roof. And Ralph was not dressed like a chicken salad sandwich.
That's for sure.
He drew the crowd. So, Ralph helped me prove that you didn't have to do a silly-dilly, laugh-a-minute show to survive, to attract sponsors.
Today, there's no program remotely like yours where people like us could even get on and reach millions of people. So you had a lot of freedom. You put on Jerry Rubin, the Yippie. You put on a lot of daring people who challenged power, anti-war, civil rights, civil liberties. You put them all on. And you didn't have trouble with the bosses upstairs because you were syndicated in 200 stations. So a station would not like one of your guests who would censor it. You still had 199 others. You weren't controlled by some guy in a skyscraper in Manhattan, New York. But you did have a problem with putting Nicholas Johnson on your show, and you almost quit if they tried to censor out Nicholas Johnson. So who was Nicholas Johnson?
Nicholas Johnson was a member of the FCC. He was an outspoken challenger of concentrated media. He was one of the early voices reminding the audience that a monopoly media squelches controversy, is cold to anti-establishment ideas such as war, and he was, how he got on the FCC, I do not recall.
Lyndon Johnson nominated him. Yeah, Lyndon Johnson. Nicholas Johnson was head of the Federal Maritime Administration, and then he moved over. He was in his early 30s, and he wrote a book called How to Talk Back to Your TV Set. But why were the bosses upstairs so upset when they let you have me on? They let all kinds of dissenters. Here's a government official, Federal Communications Commission.
Yeah. Well, first of all, they weren't thrilled about letting you on, as you say. But Johnson was attacking the very heart of their profits, of their businesses, not allowing them to have more. They wanted as many stations as they could get. And Johnson was saying, don't allow this. This is not a good idea. You'll have a monopoly media, and that's too much power, and they'll be making the decision about what gets on TV. And that still lives today. I mean, corporate ownership is, I think, the biggest challenge to a robust media featuring all kinds of voices. It lives, and I ought to know. I lost my job because I opposed the invasion of Iraq.
And this is on MSNBC.
Right, which is one of the biggest, owned by General Electric at the time, one of the biggest defense contractors in the world. And here they got this ex-talk show guy on their own station criticizing the decision to go to war and invade Iraq. And so, I was gone like a week or so before the invasion. It was definitely a corporate hit. And I think there's a lot of evidence out there that they feel a bit guilty about what they did to me, because shortly after I was fired, most of their employees who had a show opposed the invasion of Iraq. Bush was wrong for bombing crowded cities at night where old people and children were sleeping. And America, even, the majority of people came around to believe that this was a massive blunder by Bush.
And before they closed your show down in 2003, MSNBC, owned by General Electric and Microsoft at that time, they required you to have two supporters of the Iraq war boomlet for every critic. And still that wasn't enough for them. They were so terrified of George W. Bush and Dick Cheney.
Yes, they were. The anti-war voice at the time, remember, this was not long after the towers were knocked down here in New York. I mean, America, everybody, it seemed at that time, wanted to bomb something. We've got to, when Bush said, and the people who knock down these towers will hear for us soon. Yeah! And the lust for war was palpable. And, here comes Donahue saying, wait a minute, are you sure he has weapons of mass? Do we know? And some brave members of Congress spoke up. But the debate in Congress about whether to give Bush the freedom to go to war not only survived, but was overwhelmingly approved. Only 23 senators voted no.
I should say to our listeners that you did have Nicholas Johnson on because you threatened to quit. But General Electric and Microsoft owning MSNBC, they didn't even give you the chance. They just told you, I think on Monday, clear out your staff and your desks by Friday. It's over. Just because you wanted to air the criticisms of Bush and Cheney's drumbeat to engage in that criminal war of aggression in Iraq, which was not declared. But you've always had that reputation of wanting to put on the air people who were not just controversial, but people who were considered against civil rights, against civil liberties, or religious right-wingers. You had Reverend Jerry Falwell on for 30-some times. But you also had Donald Trump on in 1987 when he was a 41-year-old brash businessman, and you were quoted last year in an interview that you would be, quote, first in line, end quote, to interview Trump today. So what would you ask Trump if you interviewed him today? What would you talk about?
Oh, man, I've been asked that before. Well, I'd ask him, what is the difference between ISIS and, now I can't think of the other.
Al-Qaeda?
Well, yeah, that would be one example. I'd like to get into his head, He's bragging about crotch grabbing. They let you do it if you're a star. That was recorded, as you know. I mean, I would throw right back at him some of the more embarrassing things he has said. How do you explain this, Mr. President? Talk to him about his racist response to black people who wanted to rent units in one of his apartment buildings. His multi-serial philandering. Oh, God, I mean, where do you start with this guy?
Well, you were critical of the way journalists covering or handling Trump after he became president. You said journalists should, quote, get out of Washington, end quote, and spend more time talking with Trump's voters, the real people. What do you think motivated Trump's voters, other than the Democratic Party's anemic history in recent years?
Well, there are a lot of broken dreams in America. And there are some things I think that those who are almost gagging in their condemnation of Trump today, I mean, they can't think of enough adjectives to describe the contempt they feel for this horrible man who has taken our presidency. That's how the mainstream elite media, as he would call them, feel about America. This is our country. This is our America. But I think that if they could just start breathing again and consider that this problem lies not in the stars, but in ourselves. When Trump walks out, he gets in his big airplane, he flies to the nearest airport that will take his plane, gets off the plane, 4 limousines meet him on the tarmac and drive him to the nearest, largest venue. And he walks out on the stage applauding, looked like he's applauding for himself, and his big red tie and his hair, not an empty seat. And what you see in the foreground are arms raised with cell phones taking his picture all across the vast width of the stage. Who are those people? Who are they? Now, these people haven't, this is a hard point to make because a lot of journalists will say that, well, we covered that. Well, they did, but not enough. These are people whose kids are addicted to opioids. Their children can't pay back their college loans. The wage earner of the family, if he has a job, he hears that the company he works for is about to be sold to either China or some eastern country, and their congressmen have fabulous health care, that it's affordable. Hillary just made $100,000 for a speech to Goldman Sachs. Their CEO makes 600 times their salary. You can't do that to people. Sooner or later, they're going to go kaboom. And in this case, kaboom meant voting for a guy who walked out on the stage and said, "You're being screwed." And every one of these people in the audience raise their cell phones and say, "Yeah, the first candidate to finally speak for us." And the result, a lot of nice people. We have to understand this. A lot of nice people voted for Donald Trump. And they feel totally abandoned. They feel that no one is paying attention to them. Everybody has a better deal than they do, especially the elite. And there's certainly media is not really paying attention to them. Media is Trump, Trump, Trump all day long. What's not being covered? We bombed a hospital run by Doctors Without Borders. Bombed the hospital. What is not being covered? Imagine the news that we aren't hearing about. I mean, this is for a egomaniac. Can you imagine to suddenly wake up with all these perks? And he's sitting there fantasizing about having Trump on his name on high-rises in Moscow and all kinds of other places around the world. I mean, this is an orgy of self-indulgence, and we have allowed this to happen. I'm reading a book by Chris Hedges, who is a very, very brave and totally outspoken. He thinks the American idea is over. We can never recover what the framers have set up for us. We can never get back. I mean, you read this book, you got to lay down. This is, and there's a piece of you that says, maybe he's right. Nobody can dissent. We brought jingoism to a new level. We are the strongest people. We are the last superpower of the free world. No one can really survive without us. We are the strongest military. It goes on, and nobody can dissent. Dissent is treasonous.
Well, speaking of that, that's why we miss Phil Donahue, because all these dissenters, people who have the facts, people who want to turn the country around, basically have no opportunity to reach large audiences. Just to give you an example, you remember when you had Dr. Sidney Wolf of the Public Citizen Health Research Group on with his book, Worst Pills, Best Pills, and you would go through one brand name pharmaceutical after another. They were all approved by the FDA. Some had bad side effects, and some had minimal side effects. That's why Worst Pills, Best Pills. And the audience would be fascinated, and they'd stand up and say, so-and-so has high blood pressure, and they're taking this drug, and it's getting them groggy, and maybe that's why the person fell and broke her hip, and the ratings went through the roof, and 500,000 copies of this very low-priced book, life-saving book, Worst Pills, Best Pills, were sold on the show. And then after your show was over, he put out a new edition, and he couldn't even get on afternoon national TV. So even though it would have generated high ratings. So what's going on with afternoon talk shows when even subject matter that grabs millions of people, like Worst Pills, Best Pills did, can't even get on any of these shows that focus on sadistic, masochistic, imploding stories and ignore the big issues of our times? Do you ever watch afternoon TV?
Well, I watch the cable shows. I watch MSNBC. It's like a guilty pleasure. It's like being able to look into the window of the office from which you've been fired.
Oh, these are shows like Dr. Phil and Ellen DeGeneres. They're afternoon TV. Nobody has any authority to talk about working families or consumers or health care or corporate crime or fairer tax system or what global corporations are doing to the country. They can't get on, no matter whether they have a book or whether they have a documentary.
I think that about you. Why don't we see more of you? It's hard to make this point without, sounding like kissing a baby, but you have to be popular. Amy Goodman, a fabulous voice, whose motto is go to where the silence is. You don't see her. The word is out that you've got to make people happy. You've got to make them laugh. They have to like you. And the feeling is that me and you and Amy, for example, are scolds. Nobody likes a scold. And if you're out of work, and as I say, your kids have dropped out of school because they can't pay their college loans, you don't want to be preached to. All right. I understand your point, but I'm going to turn to the channel where contestants are dressed like a chicken salad sandwich. I want to be entertained. And,
it's sort of like a Brave New World in 1984 combined, but I've just come out with a book called To the Ramparts, how Clinton, Bush, and Obama paved the way for Trump, and how it's not too late to turn it around. I think a lot of the listeners to the program because we do have all kinds of bad things described on the show by authoritative people, but we always give them something to do. And I think the main way to start turning this country around is to take control of Congress. That people have got to grab control of Congress from global corporations and all the swarming lobbyists every day. And they can do it. There's only 535 people. And as you once said on the show, Phil, they all put their shoes on every day like we do. And we've got over 300 million people back home, and 1% of them can organize in congressional districts and turn this situation around. I mean, the Congress, has enormous authority, spending, taxing, investigating, legislating on behalf of workers and patients and consumers, and all these things that the polls show 70-80% of the American people want, like full Medicare for all or a living wage or cracking down on corporate crime. That all starts with Congress. And that's why when we put out the book, Who Runs Congress, we got on your show, Phil. You turned it into the best-selling book on Congress in American history. And a few months ago, I was talking with some publishers on the phone in New York. They weren't interested in an update. They said, who would read it? Who would buy it? That's where we're down to now. But that doesn't mean that we can't get 1% of the people organized to have a Congress watchdog hobby, so to speak, and put in a few hundred hours a year representing majority opinion in this country, a lot of conservative liberals on the same side on many of these issues, to start this upward bound process. Because, as you indicated, in fact, you told me in 1996, we live in a culture of decay, and it's only gotten worse.
Now, let's understand that less than half of us vote. The people who brag most about, I'm a proud American, and this is the country that I celebrate, and all of that, are often the people who can't identify their congressman or woman. The lowest percentage of turnout for voting is the first group, the youngest, what is it, 18 to 24. It's down around 18%, 20% of those eligible voters don't vote. We have not inspired our young people to stand in line, think about who they want to represent them, and go into a booth and vote. As long as that is true, you have to wonder, what is our future here? Beg people to go out and exercise the fundamental right of a democracy? It's shameful, and we're sending young people to war with Obama. On Obama's watch, we used drones to send Hellfire missiles into crowded places where people were gathering or sleeping. Drones. On Obama's watch, we were killing children. There is no recognition of this awfulness on the part of the American population. We don't know this has happened.
Listeners don't know. Phil grew up, he worked at hard jobs starting in his teenage years. He doesn't like much to talk about those hard times, but it's a fact in his biography. And he grew up very Catholic. He went to Notre Dame, and then he began to learn about the discrimination that came out of the Catholic Church. And can you talk a little bit about that? Were you surprised 10, 15 years ago when the pedophile stories came out? Because you did put on critics of the Catholic Church for being, as you called it, sexist and racist and sometimes destructive. And I'll tell you, that made a lot of waves. I mean, that was very courageous in those times. Can you bring us up to date on this? Did you have any glimmer of what's going on now in Pennsylvania and Boston and elsewhere?
We did do the first show on cleric priest pedophilia. The guest was a reporter for the New Orleans Times-Picayune.
About when was that?
That would be 43, somewhere in there. And, with my mother watching from her apartment in Cleveland, I'm on the air with this guy saying, "This is the church's Watergate." And I thought, that's a little overstated. But he went on.
This was about 40 years ago?
83, yeah.
Or 1983, yeah. Okay.
83, 93, 30 years ago.
And what was the audience reaction, and what was the public's reaction after this?
Well, I had priests call me and say, "How am I supposed to be in the playground where you're screaming and slamming the phone down?" It was painful. But now, what we see, I'm just fascinated. And by the way, how'd you like to be a priest? A worker priest who doesn't abuse children or adults. People look at them, with funny suspicion. Must be awful. And the manner in which the church has spoken of gayness, homosexuals, is, I think, that the church should itself go to confession for the way that it's really diminished and abused gay people. It's a sin. God does not look with favor on this, and on and on and on. You're just a terrible, terrible person if you're gay. It has to change. There is no other option.
Phil, we talked about this in a prior program. I want to bring Steve Scorvan in on this. And the suggestion was made that since you don't seem to have all these abuses pouring out of Protestant clergy or clergy in other religions where they allow the member of the clergy to marry, and the discussion centered around dropping the requirement for celibacy for Catholic priests. You want to comment on that, Steve, and what the reaction was to that?
Yeah, you and I talked about that, Ralph, and then a listener wrote in and kind of warned us against equating pedophilia with the celibacy issue, that's a different thing, that it's more about power. But then again, Ralph, you made the point that how come you don't see this in these other denominations? So I understood both points of that, because there is a danger to, first of all, equate pedophilia with homosexuality, which has nothing really to do with, but that it's more about power. I don't know how you come down on that, Phil.
Well, I've obviously interviewed many behaviorists who've made that point, and it's true. Gay people have just had their own essential self to be besmirched by the feeling that gayness equals pedophilia. A child who is sexually abused is more likely to be abused by an uncle or another member of the family than by a stranger or a gay person. And I've interviewed a number of gay organizations that have spoken out about this church scandal has, appeared to take gay people down with them. And that's a tragedy for gay people. It's funny that the church is so homophobic and yet has the largest institutional closet in the world. Somewhere there's a Pulitzer Prize waiting for somebody to get into this and make it clear the whole reality of child abuse among clergy and other powerful adults who use their power to abuse helpless young people who have no idea what's happening and cannot possibly generate the power to do something about it, having been taught all their lives to respect the holiness of this adult person. And the other thing that's, I think, awaiting a Pulitzer Prize is, what did the nuns know, and when did they know it? I wrote a piece for the Washington Post that was published, in which it was a kind of a thank you to a nun who befriended me when I was, 8th grade, 12th, whatever it was, and wrote a very nice note to me on the first page of a missal, a Holy Catholic Mass prayer book that she gave to me on the occasion of graduating from high school. Dear Philip, congratulations. Through this missal, which is dedicated to Mary, may you come to know her and love her son. Something like that. I wrote a piece. Thank you, sister. The other day I heard you died. I'm sorry. I never thanked you. And I went on to say how the nuns were the backbone of the Catholic school system, one of the most successful private school system ever devised. I mean, thousands of people were educated, and it never could have happened without the nuns who asked for no pay, and about how nervous they were when Father came to our class, and on and on. And the Washington Post published it. Well, the roof fell in on me, and I'm still trying to figure out why. The complaint was registered by the nun who worked at the National Catholic Bishop's office in Washington, Sister Mary Ellen Walsh, I think was her name. And she's since died. I never met her, but the fact that she brought me down was part of her obituary, also in the Post. Well, I did change names, and I didn't notify the reader that the names were changed. Okay, you got me. I pled guilty to that. What else have I done? Well, it went on and on. They called. Did I give the money that I earned? I think it's $700 for the piece from the Post, and I gave it to the Sisters of St. Joseph in suburban Cleveland. And they were calling. They called there. Did he give you that? And the nun said, yes, he did. And I don't know why there was such hostility to this. What did I do that would rouse this kind of and provoke this kind of attack and feedback? So the legacy of anger is out there. Anger that's not expressed, imagine reading about your own organization in the paper about what's happening in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania and these other terrible, terrible revelations about pedophilia from Holy Catholic priests in all of these places, and there's no way for you to fight back. Well, Donahue comes along with a piece about a nun, which, and I said, you never said the Jews killed Jesus. Thank you, sister. I have been slapped by a religious brother, which is true. Never a sister. I mean, I had a brother of Holy Cross order me to come to the head of the class, and he belted me, bang, my head snapped in front of the whole class.
This is in high school?
Yeah, high school. I remember his name. I'll never forget it. I just had my hands in my pockets, and I didn't move, and boy, my head went. I remember it because I wanted to cry, not because of the pain, but because of the humiliation of getting belted in front of the whole class. And I really fought it. I never, ever had that kind of feeling before. It was painful to fight back the almost involuntary need to cry. So all of these things I remembered. I wish I had included them in the book that you referred to.
The book is Donahue, My Story. It came out in 1979. Tell me, Phil, is anybody in the media asking you to come on and be interviewed and talk about the media today and politics and what is being censored, what is being excluded from the public's attention, NPR, PBS, the networks, the cable shows?
No, I am not invited on any of these programs. You never see, for example, Amy Goodman on Meet the Press. I don't know when the last time you were on Meet the Press, Ralph.
2008 was the last time. You can't get on now. They have this ritual. All these Sunday shows.
That's 10 years ago.
Yeah, all these shows, they have the same people on, Kellyanne Conway and the political consultants and, Lindsey Graham from South Carolina. And, Chuck Todd told me that he's not in control of his show. He can't decide who's going to be on the round table. And unlike his predecessor, who had me on as a young lawyer, author of Unsafe at Speed, and put this issue before millions of people, that's Larry Spivak, the first moderator of Meet the Press back in 1966 or so. That wouldn't happen today. It's all political gossip, the frantic news of what Trump did or what he tweeted.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think we all have to speak out against this.
I don't want to be a hypocrite. You know, we have to ask, if I had a show, I'd have Trump on. I would. I don't think I'd go with the chorus that we see now. Certainly not every day or every Sunday. But if you don't feature those people, you're going to get beat. Certainly Trump. Trump is the star. Trump is Elvis. Trump, and we have to acknowledge this. You know, if it bleeds, it leads. I used to call the Ohio State Patrol every morning when I'd get to work at WHIO radio. And I'd say, the first thing I'd say, the guy'd pick up the phone, Officer Fenner, Ohio State Patrol, Arcanum or Columbus or whatever it was. And I would say, give me fatals. I didn't want property damage accidents. I wanted PIs, personal injuries, or best of all, fatals. Fatals are more important than property damage accidents. So, what are we going to do? I mean, now what?
Well, you had me on your show on that subject once, and I proposed this audience network since the people who own the public airways were the landlords and the radio and TV stations are the tenants, and they decide who says what 24 hours a day and who doesn't say what, and they pay nothing for their license, no rent. You were quite interested in that. And that was the last time I could ever talk about it on national TV, like over 30 years ago. Before we get Steve Skrovan, and I know he wants to ask you something important, where do you stand on this anonymity? So much of the vicious commentary on the Internet comes because it's anonymous. You write a letter to the editor that's printed in the newspaper, you got to put your name behind it. You go on the Donahue Show, you put your name behind it. Now this mass anonymity is unleashing horrendous vitriol against both people who are controversial and people who are innocent. What do you think about that with the First Amendment?
Well, first of all, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of an audience are these people reaching? Some of it, I think, falls of its own weight. It's just so ridiculously angry and baseless that it has to be dismissed. If it isn't, then I think the people who are absorbing this are themselves corrupt in a major way, and also visibly so, and not worthy of my time to listen to. So let's not huff and puff. I would say, easy, big fella. It's either this or a controlled overseer, a government.
It's interesting, Phil. I've talked to some newspaper editors. I say you always require the name on a letter to the editor in your print edition, but on your website you don't. And they say, well, because we want a lot of participation. We want a lot of people to come in. And after all, it is a business, Ralph. Steve, do you have some observations or questions of Phil Donahue?
Yes, I do. And this is actually something you can chime in on too, Ralph, but I'll direct it to you, Phil. What was it about the 60s and 70s that made it possible to talk about serious issues, especially for you in the daytime? Was it because it was a time of relative prosperity and people had room in their brains and they weren't exhausted? Why do you think that was such a heyday?
Well, I think as I look back on what we did and accomplished, I think that the audience out there wanted a show like ours, and nobody else gave it to them. Women, for example, were very, very patronized then. The women's movement had just gotten rolling. It wasn't really, it might have just started to lift off. But there was a belief in the halls of the decision makers in my industry that women cared only about covered dishes, needlepoint, diapers, children, nursing. And we proved this axiom to be untrue. Women were reading more sections of the newspaper than their husbands. Women were longing for an opportunity to get out of the house and maybe, work in a productive venue. Children were being influenced by a father who walked out of the house in a nice suit and went off to some mysterious place, while mom went to the basement to do the wash. That, by the way, that analogy or incident is a rather exaggerated. You have to be wealthy to understand what the hell. Many children didn't have a basement or a washing machine, but nevertheless, all the feminists were pointing out that children get too much mother and not enough father. And when they said that, they made me feel guilty because they were talking about me. So I don't know. I think, remember that in the 1960s, America was right in all things. We won all our wars. We were the most powerful in the world. And that attitude of this jingoism inbred in the American psyche, people started to believe this. And if you believe this, you're going to go to war. Every American, if you give a president a cruise missile, he will fire it. And they have. It's just amazing. Trump fired a missile. I forget which country, but he actually fired it. What happened then? That story is over. Was there any afterlife to that? Did anybody examine that? Why did he do it? How many did we kill?
They don't even examine the Pentagon budget, which is over half of the government's operating expenditures. It's unauditable, and it's in violation of federal law since 1992. The Government Accountability Office of the Congress throws its hands up in the air every year and says, we don't have information to audit the Pentagon budget. And it's one reason why the missiles keep building up and wars occur and black budgets fund them. And that's the problem. Unfortunately, Phil, we are out of time. I cannot say, and we'll be back in a moment, but it's been delightful spending an hour with you, and I think the media is missing a big beat by not having you on periodically to comment on the present times of our society and world. And do consider putting pen to paper, if I may.
I have to say, Ralph, I'm impressed with your brain is still working as it did back in the 60s when I first became awed by Unsafe at Any Speed. So you have wonderful DNA. You really do sound sharp as ever. And, someday I'll find out if you're taking pills or how you've done this. But it's a wonderful, wonderful thing to hear you so clear, precise, and articulate, especially when I've looked up at age 83 and find myself struggling to think of the first name of somebody,
You're always too modest, Phil. Thank you very much. Thank you what you've done for our country, our culture, our First Amendment. There's nobody like you who've proved what defending and using the First Amendment can lead to a more just and open society. Thank you, Phil.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Let's take more advantage of this wonderful blessing of having been born into the freest nation on earth, although I think it'd be better if somebody from another country said that about us.
Well said anyway, coming from you, Phil.
All right. Thank you, Ralph.
We've been speaking with legendary broadcaster Phil Donahue. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Now let's take a short break and check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, September 21, 2018. I'm Russell Mokhiber. It's one thing to advertise to children. It's another thing to pay parents to turn their offspring into an advertisement. But that's what Kentucky Fried Chicken is doing. KFC last month launched a contest to lure parents into selling their newborn baby's identity to KFC for life. Parents who named their child Harland after KFC founder Harlan Colonel Sanders and agreed to the terms of the contest are eligible to receive $11,000 toward their child's college education. Only one child will be selected, leaving many other children named Harlan by hopeful parents stuck with the KFC branded names for life. The selected child's identity, including name, pictures, voice, likeness, and biographical information, will be owned by KFC for advertising purposes. The company won't provide any additional compensation or even notify the parents when the child's likeness is used. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. That's our show. I want to thank our guest today, Phil Donahue. For those of you listening on the radio, we're going to check out now. For you podcast listeners, we got some bonus material in the wrap-up. A transcript of this show will eventually appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website. We're getting better at getting those up quicker. For Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com. Visit the American Museum of Tort Law and go to tortmuseum.org and check out the Tort Museum bookstore for engrossing books and memorabilia. The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky. Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Join us next week when we talk about rats. We're going to leave that a little mysterious. Tune in to find out what that's all about on the next Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Talk to you then, Ralph.
Thanks very much, Steve, Jimmy. Thank everybody. And the message to the audience is tune in next week. It's going to be a jolting show.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Welcome to the wrap-up. In this first piece, Ralph, as he is wont to do, gives his guest an old friend and an assignment.
Well, Phil, I think you're being too modest about yourself. I mean, societies thrive when the elderly transmit their wisdom and experience to the next generation. And I would love to see you write a book about your thoughts here. You write very clearly. You write in memorable ways. I mean, just that book that you put out in 1979 was gripping. I had some people in their 20s read it recently, and they just said, well, this is really amazing. I didn't know this, and I couldn't put the book down. So why don't you try to write a book? Listeners, Phil knows that I've been trying to get a book written on Phil as the greatest advocate and utilizer of the First Amendment in American history. Nobody has put more people on national TV that he disagrees with and that disagree with him. And that's the test of whether you believe in the First Amendment, not just put people on you agree with, like today's echo chamber at Fox News and other cable channels. He would put on people who bitterly criticized him for daring to have a show on mothers who wanted to breastfeed their children at work, or elderly couples living out of wedlock, or children being abused by people they trusted, not to mention all the major social justice movements who challenged majority opinion at the time and changed it. I just think, Phil, you really have got a lot to convey here. Tell me what you'd like to do. Am I off the wall here?
No, thank you. I'm grateful. Thank you. You know, this experience had some wonderful prizes for me. I mean, I have people come up to me in airports all over the world. Thank you, Mr. Donahue. Because of your show, I came out of the closet to my parents. Thank you, Mr. Donahue. Because of your show, I got out of an abusive marriage. Lately, I've been getting, thank you, Mr. Donahue. Because of your show, I learned to speak English. I'm a very lucky person, Ralph, and I am grateful to you for your suggestions. I cannot dismiss. I'm very appreciative. And, you know, there is, I just can't get myself to sit down and start a book. First of all, I think, I already wrote one. But, and I'm thinking, well, you're being a little self-indulgent here now. You're going to give another book about yourself. But I would like to. It would be fun. I mean, it'd be fun to go on C-SPAN and, another addiction of mine in my later life. So I'm not going to dismiss it, Ralph.
All you have to do is dictate it in a machine and have it printed out and edit it because you have great recall.
And in this final bit, Steve asks Ralph to assess an idea he came up with to describe corporate personhood.
Ralph, you have a minute. I had this thought last night because I was thinking about the Jeffrey Clements interview we did last week about people or corporations. I was trying to think of an analogy that would bring it home to people. And I thought of one, and I'm not sure it's right, and maybe you can either affirm it or find the flaw in it. But I was thinking calling corporations people is like calling a car a person. I mean, a car is operated by a person, just like a corporation is. But if a person runs into a farmer's market and just starts knocking people down, he'll hurt some people, but it won't be that damaging. But you drive your car into a farmer's market, you're going to do a lot of damage and kill a lot of people. And it seems to me that the analogy of a car to a corporation occurred to me. Do you think that's a good analogy?
Yeah, in the sense that corporations have a lot of cars and they have a lot of robots and they're still considered people.
But there's the machine of the car.
Yeah.
And when Mitt Romney says, hey, profits, that goes to people, goes to human beings.
Yeah.
Well, a car serves a function and it's operated by people and it serves people, gets them from here to there. But the car itself is not a person.
When you explain it that way, it's a good analogy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. When you just the way you explained it.
Right. All right.
Because you're saying they perform similar functions.
Right. And they're obviously, actually now with driverless, this technology trying to head for driverless cars, they're trying to even take the person out of the equation.
Yeah.
But it seemed to me when I'm trying to, this might be another arrow in my quiver when I'm talking to people about what that exactly means, because I think it is a tough thing for people to understand because they know that, what makes up a corporation is people organized in a certain way, but it's really
I used to say a corporation is not like you and me. A corporation doesn't die in Iraq. A corporation can create its own parents called holding companies. A corporation doesn't have children. I sort of say that what a corporation doesn't have that people have.
Right.
People experience.
Right. And that there's super people.
You can give your own examples. But it starts with corporations are not like you and me when I'm in front of an audience.
Right.
And then I say, can you create your own parent?
Right.
You'll come up with a lot better examples. But that's the way to make it, to really drive it home.
Right.
Once you get specific, it's really amazing. Can you create children all over the world and blame them for doing bad things so you can escape responsibility? That's what corporations do with their subsidiaries.
Yeah.
Can you go bankrupt and still be paid a nice salary to retain your experience while bankruptcy unravels and your creditors are handled? Well, corporations, the executives of corporations do that. They can get out of union contracts. They can get out of tort suits. You show the double standard, but more important, you show that they're a different legal entity completely. I mean, they have perpetual life unless they, go bankrupt. And human beings don't have perpetual life. But the best start one is creating their own holding companies. They create their own parents in order to escape regulation, for example.
Right.
Can you create your own parents to escape your responsibility?
Yeah.
That starts people thinking. So that's one way you can draw the distinction. How can they be people?
Right.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for tuning in to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way